Nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui. Welcome to the session on the Disaster Relief Fund, or as I like to call it, trademark the PIFLET. And this session is really to sort of get some ideas and information. We're not in any kind of decision-making train at this point, and so there is going to be a presentation. There will be natural pauses where I think, because there's quite a lot of information, where we can have questions along the way. And welcome to our guests, and Catherine will introduce everyone, so I'll go straight to Catherine. Thank you.
Cool. Kia ora, councillors. Thank you for coming back after a full session just before. Before we get underway, I'll just do some introductions for the team here. So you will know Jesse Phillips, who's a partner at KPMG. Jesse and his team have supported us through our CHIP establishment process and our balance sheet review last year, so he and his team are well known to you. Joining our team for this project is Scott Hamilton, who's the previous Chief Executive of Quayside Holdings, which is the Bay of Plenty Regional Council's equivalent of the PIFLET. Slightly bigger than the PIFLET. Scott was the CE there for 12 years and grew that fund from $300 million to $2.5 billion, so has a lot of insight from that example there, and is now working with councils across the country doing similar work to this, so is able to bring a great perspective from different case studies around the country. Where's my little clicker? Cool. So before we get into the discussion on the fund today, I just want to do a brief recap about why we're here and how we got here. So as you know, the council faces two major challenges to its balance sheet and financial resilience, an underinsurance problem, which we estimate is somewhere between $1.8 and $2.6 billion in a major event, and a lack of diversification in our investment portfolio, with most of our investment assets exposed to the same kinds of risks, predominantly natural hazard risks. These challenges were a core driver of our 2024 LTP and now the LTP amendment process that we're going through. And the financial strategy that we put in place needs to address these challenges in order to meet the LGA requirement for prudent financial management. And as we've discussed before, Andrea and the team have discussed before on other occasions, in practice, this solution will have a number of components to it. There's kind of no one silver bullet that can address these issues. Excuse me. So under the current LTP that's live at the moment, our financial strategy leans more heavily on the establishment of a large self-insurance or investment fund of about $500 million, which was to be established using the proceeds of the airport share sale. That was supported by a nominated insurance headroom of $272 million, which sat within our 225% debt to revenue ratio. The financial strategy that's under development for the LTP amendment shifts the reliance from a large investment fund to debt headroom as more of this kind of significant way that we're managing the financial risk. The council last week resolved to reduce the debt to revenue ratio to provide a total of $1 billion worth of available debt headroom, and has previously taken the decision to establish a smaller PIFLET, something in the order of $60 to $70 million of a sort of an equivalent self-insurance or investment fund. Alongside this, as you know, we have the work on the insurance roadmap, which is seeking to kind of better understand and model our insurance risks over time, help support our decision making about what we choose to insure or not insure, and also explore alternative risk transfer tools, especially a captive insurer. So in terms of today, we just want to take you through some initial thinking that we've been doing on the design of the Disaster Resilience Fund. The purpose of this is really to just get you thinking about some of the issues and choices that you'll have to make as we go through the process of establishing the fund. And we also want to talk a lot about some of the other councils' work going on around the country and just kind of expose some of the different choices and things that those organisations are making just to kind of work through those issues.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll kick off with a few introductory remarks, but what we thought we might spend the most portion of this session talking through is actually some examples, and we'll get Scott talking about where this has been done elsewhere. Perhaps if we just go to the next slide, and we wouldn't be good consultants if we didn't frame the challenge up with a table with some pretty logos. You know, currently you're sitting on two what we classify as investment assets on your balance sheet, obviously the leasehold land and the airport, and you're using debt headroom to manage some of your insurance risk, and those are the conversations that you've been going through. And those assets, the leasehold land and the airport, are not bad assets, particularly in good times. You know, their value increases, they deliver an income that can help offset rates. The issue is obviously in a really bad day or in a significant disaster, they could be very hard to sell, and the value and the income that comes out of them could be materially impacted. So the concept that we're going to talk about is establishing what we call the Disaster Resilience Fund, the PIF, or the PIFLIT. So that will invest in a diversified pool of assets, and when I say assets, I mean predominantly shares and bonds that critically have no direct link to the fortunes of Wellington. They are diversified away from Wellington. But in doing that, there's a number of things that we need to think about, another number of decisions and trade-offs that we need to work through. And we present some of these in this page. Core to our thinking is actually the size of the fund, obviously. You've presented us with 60 to 70 million and some decisions around that, which do have an influence on some of the things you should be thinking about, which may not be relevant for a larger fund, and we'll try to highlight those as we go through. So as I say, the purpose of the session is really to inform you about some of those decisions. We haven't necessarily landed on specific advice or have all the answers. We will try to give you an indication of the direction of travel where it's appropriate as we step through the session. Perhaps the most important thing in establishing the PIFLIT or the DIRF is to establish the objectives up front, because it drives everything around the design. So what we've done on this page is taken the challenge, taken the status quo, and turned those into 6 objectives by which we will provide advice around establishing the fund. We want to make this have a meaningful contribution to Wellington City's resilience solution. We obviously want to diversify the investment base, provide protection so that it's very well defined and hard to access the funds unless there's been a specific event, and we'll talk through what that means. We want to maintain and ultimately grow an intergenerational asset. Yes, this is going to start small, but if we make certain decisions, hopefully over time it will make a meaningful contribution through growth. And then lastly, we want to minimise the short-term impact on ratepayers. The challenge with these objectives is that they potentially conflict, and I'll point you to those last two: growing the capital value of the fund and making a payment to council to ameliorate and offset rates are in direct conflict with each other. And you've got some difficult decisions that you need to make around that, and we can present what the outcome is potentially on rates through those decisions. So the way we've set up this session is structured around 6 key questions. As I say, when and how fund could be accessed. Critically, what is its structure and its governance arrangements? And we've got a lot of detail on these slides. We're going to skip through it in the interest of time, but we're happy to come back to some questions around that. What does the fund invest in? As I say, predominantly shares and bonds, but there's other considerations like ESG and the like that we'll need to factor into it. What happens to those investment returns, as I've just mentioned? Should it be retained in the fund or paid out? And lastly, what should go into the fund to capitalise it? The last question here that we don't touch on in this session is how the DIRF and the captive intersect. My understanding is you've had sessions to explore a captive insurance vehicle. Until we've done that work, we're not in a place to provide you exactly how the two intersect, but I think for the purposes of this session, you should assume they are different things. The captive is an insurance company that's plugging gaps in your insurance stack. The DIRF is there in a really bad day, in a rainy day. They are different things for the purposes of this conversation. So what we thought we might do is spend a little bit of time stepping through examples to sort of bring this to life, because it's the easiest way to give you context on the decisions that follow, and perhaps I'll hand to Scott.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to come along and present to you. As Catherine mentioned, the first example there is an organisation that I had the privilege of running for 12 years. Quayside is a very, very broad investment company by comparison to perhaps what you'd be looking at here. But if you look at it in terms of what is its purpose? Well, its purpose is there to try and grow revenue ultimately for the council. And as you can see from the bottom right of that page, there is a very, very high reliance on this is an investment entity. In fact, it pays more money to council than the general ratepayer does. The downside of that, of course, is if Quayside or its main asset, the Port of Tauranga, has a bad day, then council has a bad day. So inside Quayside, there was a requirement to try and make sure that you had reserving or preservation of income so that you could protect council from shocks. And so that's really part of the role of Quayside that was there. Beyond that, it was there to try and act and grow a very diversified portfolio, to try and grow opportunities within the region. Probably the other thing that's very relevant in terms of here is that in 2011 we had the Rena incident off the coast of Tauranga, and there's nothing like an accident or an incident to open your eyes. In your case, you're looking at an insurance risk, right? But in our case, we actually had an incident off the coast, and you don't want to have a scenario where you've got a large portion of your income for the council coming from a single asset. That single asset is your largest asset, and it's also leveraged. And then all of a sudden you find that nobody wants to have a port in your backyard. So, these types of things are events that open up our eyes and make us think a little bit differently about how we look after our assets and how we address the issues that we're trying to address. And in the Quayside scenario, that was how we did it. Quayside is a collection of CCOs. In fact, it's about 15 CCOs under Quayside, but it also manages council assets as well. So it's uses that knowledge and that board that it has to support council. In terms of the governance piece, it is a mix of independent, predominantly majority independent board, but it does have some representation there, and the council CEO is, but it's unusual in that sense, and it's the only one in the country that's designed that way. I think that was all I wanted to, actually just last comment, protection. Look, the Port of Tauranga investment is a strategic asset of the council. The investment in Quayside itself is a strategic asset of the council as well. Probably the other protection that it has is reputation. And obviously for a new organisation you don't start with that, but the impact of Quayside in the region is such that the reputation almost is a protection in its own right. Our friends up the hill in Auckland are also looking at trying to create a future fund. So this is looking at their airport shares. In this case, where they're going is they are creating a CCO trust, which will look after the assets and basically selling the airport and diversifying that away. If you look at their purpose, they are taking quite a large portion of the income back to council, but they are leaving a small portion behind in terms of making sure that the fund itself is growing to match what they deem inflation to be, so that it is providing a real value for future generations as well. Again, single asset in this case, just a managed funds portfolio with a fully independent board. New Plymouth. So New Plymouth has been around for quite a while. Came out of 2004 with the sale of Powerco, and they went into a very mixed set of assets before in 2017 reshaping themselves and basically just going down a very similar to a DERF style approach of managed funds. Where they are at the moment, they are looking to grow that portfolio over time. They are growing some resilience into that fund, and they are doing a distribution out to council of equivalent income to try and generate that to offset some rates. The structure that they have adopted is an independent board, but it's looking after an asset of council. So in the case of Auckland, it's actually the CCTO's asset. In the case here, it's an asset of council that they are looking after. They have, and Auckland's going down the same path, tried to put on effectively an extra belt or another set of protection measures through legislation to try and then protect the proceeds of that. And the interesting one, excuse me, the interesting one with New Plymouth is that they're probably a little bit more open in terms of perhaps how some of the proceeds could be utilised, whereas Auckland is much more explicit in terms of the fact that the proceeds are not available for outside of that income stream. The actual capital is preserved. Fourth example, this is the last example that we'll go through, but there are others, is Environment Southland. So they have a stake in Southport. They have a small investment portfolio similar to the DERF, as well as some land assets as well. And they are moving from having that through multiple council committees to consolidating it into one committee, but putting independent representation into that committee so they get expertise in and around the edges. The investment portfolio that they run is largely their old reserves, but if they do proceed with their sell down of Southport, which is one of the things that they did consult on through the last LTP, then those proceeds are intended to be ring-fenced so that they are not able to be accessed. So again, putting different measures around that in terms of what is a strategic asset and how do they apply that strategic asset for themselves. So I guess just to summarise on the four of them, look, there are lots of examples of councils around the country that have investment portfolios. So in terms of what you're looking at, you're far from at the bleeding edge of what this is all about. The one thing that is different is they all have a different purpose. And those purposes are related to what they are trying to mitigate within their own area. Some of them are very focused on income. Some of them are very focused on resilience. Some of them are very focused on protection. And so we can look at all of these, we can pick up the best pieces out of each of them, but I think going back to where Jessie was in terms of some of those considerations that we have, it really is about considering what is important for Wellington as a council in terms of how you would look to structure an opportunity.
Is now one of those points for questions? Great. Councillor McNulty.
Kia ora, thanks for that. Just looking at that management structure of Quayside, is that something where Wellington Airport could be rolled into a similar type of entity where you've got PIFLET, the airport shares other things sitting side by side rolled into an entity?
Yeah, look, I'll take that. So look, a Quayside is effectively that. It is you think of it as a management company that sits over the top to provide expertise. Environment Southland is very similar in the sense you've got an investment committee that sits over the top of multiple investment assets. So yes, you could do that. You wouldn't necessarily put the airport into a fund because they have slightly different purposes, but you could have a single management entity over the top if that was an objective of council.
Any other? Yes, Councillor Pannett.
Very sorry for being late, sorry, it's a busy day. I was just interested in your last comment. How do different councils balance the different objectives that you talked about? Because everyone's got resilience issues, everyone needs money. Did you have any sort of insight into the way they balance those things?
Honestly, no, because each council is different. So it depends on what they're trying to achieve. If you're looking at I mean, Auckland's obviously taken a very large portion of the revenue that they want to derive out of the fund into supporting the services that council provides. In other cases, they don't have that same revenue stream, so maybe they're not trying to match to the same degree. And what does happen over time, and I can use the example in Quayside as well, as Quayside grew and as the revenue in Quayside grew, I was always able to try and ensure, or my entity was always able to ensure that we were giving council more. But where we grew by significant amounts, we would retain more as well, so that you ultimately start to grow the resilience. You know, it's always a difficult challenge if you're spending every dollar, because you have years where you don't earn every dollar. So, you know, it is about trying to get that balance of having a little bit of resilience, a little bit in the tank for a bad day, effectively.
Councillor Brown.
Just a sort of a question about the New Plymouth Fund, because when I looked at across all of the various funds that you've referenced, New Plymouth did strike me as the one that was the most consistent with our situation in terms of not so much the purpose, but at least the diversification issue. Would that be right? I mean, if there was, because obviously the councillors will want to spend some time thinking about their options, would New Plymouth be the one which you would perhaps suggest might be the closest to what we're looking at, and therefore the one that they might want to spend more time looking at?
I think both New Plymouth and Auckland are single assets in the sense of what they now hold is just largely a managed fund portfolio. Quayside is a much more diverse portfolio, and so therefore quite a different beast to where you would want to start, because I think you've got to learn to walk before you run on some of these things. And Southland has, again, a different blend of assets. Depends, coming back to Councillor McNulty's question about whether you want to put other assets under management or not. But if you're just looking at a single asset, then New Plymouth could be an example. What they have that you potentially don't have is scale.
I was going to say one of the key considerations that we touch on, Tim, in New Plymouth's case, they have set up a new entity, the New Plymouth Guardians Limited, and there's a cost that comes with that. They have more scale to be able to offset the cost of establishing that new entity at 60 to 70 million. That's a real consideration. If you're looking at something smaller, the Environment Southland situation, where they are simply managing it through an investment committee, a subcommittee of council with some independent representation on that committee, is also something worth looking at this scale.
Councillor McNulty?
Yeah, I was just saw in that diagram there. So the Guardians appoint an investment manager. Do we know who the investment managers are? Is it things like Craig's, Milford? Are we talking more boutique? I'm just trying to get an idea of the middle layer that sits in these.
I can take that. So I think, look, if you think of the discussion point here, we've got the question of, look, do we want a DERF or not, or a PIFLET, or an entity of any other name? If so, what is the questions around the foundations, so what is the purpose? And that's the first piece. The next piece, you get into a SIPO or getting into a policy or the guardrails that sit around the outside of that. And then once you've got that an entity established, they can then go out and pick a manager. So I think, I don't know exactly, well, I can guess who the manager of New Plymouth is, but it could be anybody. I guess the SIPO it gives the rules or the guardrails around the outside, and then the entity that's managing it then goes out and picks an active or a passive manager, whoever they think is best to deliver that outcome. And I think if you looked across all of them, they've probably all got different managers.
Right, that's all the questions at the moment.
Okay.
I have one.
Sorry, I had no way of seeing that. Is that Councillor Wineta online?
It is. Sorry about that. Hey, look, just while we're talking about New Plymouth, two things. Firstly, I recall reading that the value had dipped, and it still potentially hasn't broken even. So I guess my question is, what happened to rates in New Plymouth during that time? And second of all, are there any pitfalls that we can learn from in terms of avoiding them from that experience?
So maybe I'll touch on that. My understanding was that this the PIF fund was established in 2004, and as we know, 4 years later, the global financial crisis happened in 2008. There was a material reduction, not just in the PIF investment fund, but a lot of investment funds and pension funds around the world, and this fund took a hit. My understanding and the information we've got is that it has subsequently recovered, and the figures on this slide suggest that it's about 50% higher than where it was at the date it was established, and that sort of proves a point that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. Yes, there will be volatility, particularly when you're investing funds for growth. We all know that's the case. But if you're investing for the long term, history suggests there is a good basis for having confidence that the fund will grow through time. It also suggests on the slide that there's been $240 million paid out to subsidise rates through that period. So we can get you more information on exactly the performance, but my understanding is that it has recovered and actually grown in the interim.
Thank you.
Did you have another question, Councillor Wineta? You said you had two.
No, that was all. Thanks.
All right, we'll move on. Thank you.
So we're going to step through some of the key design choices here, and as I say, we haven't landed specifically on a recommendation, but we will give you a direction of travel, and happy to answer questions at the end of this section. There's 5 questions we want to run through. The first is when and how the fund could be accessed, and perhaps we jump to the first slide. Busy slide, lots of words, but there's 3 sort of sub-questions to this component. How should an excess event be defined? Should there be a special distribution? Can we define, for example, a small event, a Kaikoura-style event, versus something that's Christchurch or even worse? Can we build that into the governing documents? Secondly, who in the governance layer actually makes the decision to access the fund when it's appropriate to do so? And thirdly, what are the conditions to access that? What has to happen first? What other sources of fund or options do we need to step through? And we'll come back to you with more detail, but the way I like to think about it is there is a spectrum of options here. On the far right, you could have very restrictive access, essentially make it only drawn down in a very, very bad day, with reference to a specific event, so that the fund is essentially perpetual, and that allows the investment manager to invest with confidence in the long term, go after a little bit more growth because it's got confidence, other than in the really bad day, low probability event, the funds will be there. On the far left, you could have a much more permissive, flexible regime where a distribution is really up to the judgment of the governing body at the day, much more able and easy to access depending on the circumstances at the time. Our initial thinking, and we'll talk a little bit about how other funds have approached this, given you're establishing this fund for the purposes of assisting with an insurance gap with definition to an event, is to try to define that access event and actually make it reasonably restrictive when it is accessed, and that will give us the advantage of being able to go to the investment manager and say, yes, we'd like to invest this for the long term. We'll accept some volatility through time, but we want to grow it over time and make a meaningful difference to the insurance gap is where we're headed. Scott, have you got any comments about how other funds have approached this?
Yeah, look, I guess just to kind of simplify this, we all apply this principle in our own lives in one sense as well. You know, if we had $800,000 in our back pocket to go and buy your average Wellington house, and we were going to buy the house next week, we probably wouldn't put it in the share market. We'd put it in the bank because we want to access it next week. If we had $800,000 in our pocket and we were 40 and we're going to retire in 25 years and we're not going to touch it, then we put it into a growth objective because we know that we've basically got that long-term duration. So we're kind of asking exactly the same thing here, which is if we think about the proceeds that council has or that are raised and put into a fund, what is the expectation that we're going to draw on it? Because in one sense it actually creates, or it changes the dynamic of what you can earn off that, because if you can only put it in the bank, you only earn so much, but if you can put it out there and you can accept volatility because you know that you're a long-term intergenerational investor, then you know you can have a different behaviour. And I think each of those other funds have taken that decision that basically, look, they are long-term intergenerational investors in terms of that approach, and they've tried to limit the way that access to capital that comes. And if I use some of the examples, and even Quayside's target was always to distribute out of the income that it was earning, not out of the capital that was there. And that's kind of the principle, unless you're into that disaster type event that I was referring to.
Great. Do you
want to have questions on that last slide? Or we've got a few to go? Okay, keep going.
So look, really there's, in terms of the structure that we're looking at, there's probably 3 or 4 different things that we really need to try and weigh up. One of them is the governance and the legal form that sits there, and if you use the left-hand extreme, then it stays in council, and that's one option, or you go completely external, and that gives you a form of protection because you've got a constitution and other bits and pieces that kind of sit outside and an independent board or a board. You then get the role of, do you want independent experts to support you? Is it council-only governance, or is it fully independent, or is it somewhere in the middle? The third one is really about the level of protection. You know, do you want to have a low level of protection, or do you want to have a high level of protection? Depending on how far up the scale you want to go, it costs you more money. I mean, that's ultimately what it's all about. And then the costs are also related to the scale. And so therefore, you know, you can have a low cost simple fund, or you can have a higher cost larger fund. And again, the scale is the thing that kind of tips you up and down that. But if you trickle through each of those 4 things, then ultimately we end up with a series of potential recommendations at the bottom. One is an internal fund, or an internal fund with the governance of a CCCO, in other words, a council asset, but governed by an external party, or you put it fully outside of council as an option.
And just to perhaps link those back to the examples we just talked through, option 1 looks a little bit like Environment Southland, albeit it's got, as I say, some independence on its committee. Option 2 is essentially the New Plymouth PIF, It's a council asset but managed by a separate CCO. And option 3 is the Auckland Future Fund. It's a full CCO that owns the assets. Our initial thinking, given the size of this fund, is somewhere between option 1 and option 2. We don't have the scale to justify setting up a full asset owning CCO with $60 to $70 million as we were initially tracking.
Okay. Now we'll go to this number 3. So this one here basically just shows, and probably if we just focus on the left-hand graphic a little bit, and it comes back to that analogy you used before about whether you want to put it in the bank or you want to put it in the markets. The more active you are and the more growth orientated you are, the better your returns will be, and the faster you will grow your portfolio and the faster you will grow your resilience. It's relatively simple in terms of that. Most of the examples that you see from around the country these days, yes, everyone sit there and say that growth portfolios are higher risk, which is true. But actually, if the liquidity need of the council is not that it needs to draw it out each day, then it's able to, as a long-term investor, tolerate ups and downs for the benefit of longer-term returns. This slide here probably is the one which really tells you the difference or the trade-off. Because if you took all the money and put it into a fund and you never gave any benefit back to council on an annual basis, you're just growing a fund for an event, then in that top scenario there, then your fund will grow faster. So if you keep taking money out, then you will end up with a lesser fund, and it's really about council trying to determine what is it trying to grow for future ratepayers and what benefit it is also trying to leave there for each individual year's ratepayer.
Just to give you some context here, that top line, no distribution, means all of the income that was expected from the ground leases that were expected to sell for the $60 to $70 million. If that was retained and grown in the fund and we got our 7% return, you can see the top line. There's a cost, obviously. There's a cost because you can't offset rates. Modelling suggests that's about 0.6%. Increase to your rates bill, that top line. On the other hand, if you match the ground lease income that's currently in your LTP, obviously there's no impact on rates. So that presents the two bounds. We would like, for the purposes of the fund, to have as much money retained in the fund so it can do what it needs to do and grow through time, recognising there's a very difficult trade-off here, and perhaps the answer is somewhere between the two, and we've given you a light blue line there as an example. But this is probably the most difficult decision that a lot of councils have grappled with. As Scott mentioned, the Auckland Future Fund is forecasting a return of 7.64%. They are paying 5.2% of that. Excuse me, 7.64 after costs is 7.2. They're paying 5.2% of that out to current ratepayers, so it's only increasing at the rate of inflation. There's no additional growth. And the other funds have withheld more than that.
Some questions now? Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, I guess when we're going back into control, I think, only New Plymouth and Auckland Council CCOs really have any legislated protection, and obviously Wayne Brown right now is trying to tear down some of that CCO protection. So I'm trying to think around because any council decision can theoretically overturn the structure. So are there contractual guarantees that can penalise the withdrawals to a point of making it a disadvantaged move from council that we might be able to review to protect that capital?
Perhaps should we jump to this slide on protections? Yep. Does that make sense? Yeah. We've skipped over this, but there is some detail here. There are a number of protections you can embed into a fund, and the local bill, the legislation is one of those that's being pursued in Auckland and in New Plymouth, which is obviously very difficult to unwind. On the far left, there's three others that we've highlighted in this chart. The far left, there's a council supermajority requirement to change any governing deeds. You could obviously embed that in the founding documents of your fund. Yes, it's not impenetrable, obviously, but it sets a high threshold for making changes. Secondly, you've got the protections of the Local Government Act should you deem the fund itself to be a strategic asset. You're in an interesting position. The ground leases themselves, as my understanding, are not a strategic asset and therefore don't have the protections of the LGFA as it comes to consultation. But you could obviously make the fund itself deemed a strategic asset to protect it under the LGA. And then you've got the protections inherent in governance, and that's where the trade-off through that slide that we talked through is really important. Yes, lower cost, more simple structure, but an inherently lower level of protection because you've not got those layers of governance to get through to extract money out of it. And that's the debate that Auckland have been having. They've got a strategic asset they've put in that fund. It's a much larger pool of money, and I imagine heightens the debate to a certain degree.
I'm not sure if it's a Jen or Sean question or someone else, but a supermajority, can a bare majority of council overturn the requirement for a supermajority? Does anyone in the room know? Can we maybe take that back for a...
Yeah, we might need to look at what provisions there might be for that. I'm not aware of
Could
any.
you 8-8 with a casting vote to say we no longer need a supermajority, I suppose is my question. And the other one I had was, could you phase the returns against rates over time? So, you're saying 0.6% is the estimated, so each year we dive that down by 0.1%, so within 6 years the entire fund is investing in itself, but you... Yeah.
So yes, you can. I mean, each of these, if you think of how much you're giving back to council out of the fund, it's effectively a distribution policy from the fund. And you can set a distribution policy that starts at a level, and it might be that it just distributes a fixed amount, a flat amount to council. But if the fund is growing, then obviously the portion that's distributed gets smaller and smaller and smaller each year. So there are different measures that could be applied, and again, this is about council determining what that purpose is so that you can go away and draw it up.
Councillor Rogers?
For the, I guess, captive, we had this discussion around what sort of legislative barriers there might be in terms of offshore assets. So I guess I was wondering sort of how much that applies to the situation in terms of investments that we might make onshore versus offshore, if there are any.
No, so in that sense, no, there aren't. I mean, you would invest. New Zealand has a good legislation in terms of the PI legislation for managing investments. Council itself is also not a taxpayer, so you want to work out whether, or a zero-rated taxpayer, so you want to work out whether you want to take advantage of that or not, and that becomes part of that. Where does it sit? But a New Zealand PI can invest into any international market, particularly in terms of share trading and those types of things.
Cool, thank you.
It doesn't stop you in your SIPO establishing some parameters around what it can invest in. You might have ethical considerations. For example, the more restrictive you make it, the harder it is for the fund to earn its return.
Councillor Pannett?
That was a nice segue because it was where
It was almost like you were called upon there.
Yeah, so look, obviously we've had a bit of discussion around ethical investing, and we know that the returns might not be as much. Have you done, do you understand how much less? Have you done any modelling? Because I know some investors might have a different view that sometimes ethical investing can, perform on par.
What I will say, look, we haven't modelled it as far as this exercise is concerned because we're probably not at that stage yet. But from my general experience, the nature of ethical investing is changing. And so I think historically we used to go very much down the exclusion path, and we don't like this and we don't like that and we don't like the other thing. Actually, there's a lot more activism now in terms of share management, and so it's a lot more about principles based and making sure that companies are doing the right things, less than exclusions, and sometimes it's a little bit of both. So those things are changing. In terms of the return, it does cost more. The more you screen over the top, the more it costs. And in some cases, you have had an overabundance of money flowing into certain sectors where there hasn't been enough effectively assets to buy, and that's just pushed prices up. So that's where some of those lesser returns have come from. But look, it is, and again, this is a discussion we could have further down the track. But what does council want around some of those ethical principles?
And is there a way of modelling the impact of worse impacts from things like climate change, as opposed to your level of investment? Sorry, I haven't expressed that very well. But you get a cost if you don't invest properly as well.
You can, and if you look, well, I guess probably the best example to look at is entities within New Zealand like the Super Fund and ACC, those larger investment companies. They have responsibility in terms of reporting around climate and other disclosures. And so I think, it's a journey that everybody's on at the moment. There's not so much about penalties, but it'll be interesting to see if some of them are falling afoul of what the government wants to see there, what actions they need to take.
Councillor Free.
Yeah, it's probably a hard question to answer, but there was a lot of debate about whether the airport, our airport, was returning an equivalent sort of amount to an investment fund. So on average, what would you be likely to expect from the sort of size of capital that we might have as a return?
It depends a little bit about the risk and volatility that you want to take. I think the previous slides that we had suggested, if you take a growth type investment approach, which other funds have, that's what Auckland has suggested, it's what New Plymouth are suggesting. History suggests that you'll earn on average around about 7% after fees based on history. There's no guarantee, but that's what you might reasonably expect over the long term. If you take a more conservative approach and don't like volatility, it'll obviously come down from there, and we've shown you a model portfolio which is more like 40% shares and 60% fixed income, which materially reduces your return. But I think a reasonable expectation, if you were to say invest this fund with a growth mandate for the long term based on history and the data we've got, is sort of 7% thereabouts.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, just pull the band-aid off this one just because Councillor Pannett started talking about ethical investing. So if you take like the ASB KiwiSaver issue at the moment, where there's some holdings in Israeli companies, and there's a quite sizable campaign out there around wanting them to divest, there's a certainty you would have similar issues in this institution depending on where some of the holdings are. So I guess, have you thought about structures and how you may reflect the willpower or either inoculate the fund on the other foot from such discussions? And if not, maybe it's one just to think about.
So, look, I'll have a little crack at that one, because I used to work at ASB once upon a day, so there we go. Look, the answer is that a lot of these things are done on a best endeavours basis. So, yes, you know exactly what you want to try and invest into, and if you're investing directly into companies, then you have a fairly good feel for what you're actually targeting. Again, it comes back to, are you looking at principles or are you looking at exclusions? And a lot of entities like the New Zealand Super Fund, for example, will not invest into anything where New Zealand has, I'll call it a diplomatic challenge with, for want of a better word. I know in the case of Quayside, I had something which I wouldn't invest into something which my council had a problem with in terms of a local entity as well. So, there is you can put some of these things in. They are obviously on a best endeavours basis, and situations with companies do change, and that's about being active in terms of managing or making sure that your investment manager is active in managing that ESG requirement.
I do want to be clear on the expected role of the council. The council's role in establishing these funds will be to set things like investment principles and boundaries. What would look bad would be if the council is determining exactly what the fund is putting this money into, because there's a professional fund manager there for a reason to establish and invest for the purposes of the fund.
Keep going. Oh, sorry, Councillor Rogers.
I guess my follow-up question to that would be, if a situation did arise where there was perhaps a decision of the governing body that they wanted to amend what those principles were, would that be something that, could a conversation be had at that level, or was it kind of something set and forget?
No, so look, again, coming back to the discussion point today, do we want a pamphlet, a DERF, whatever it is, and anything else we like to call it, what are the principles that we want to try and what's our purpose? Then we get into the question around the SIPO. Now, that SIPO is a statement of investment policy and objectives. That's basically council's guardrails that sit around the outside that says, this is what you're here to do, this is what you can't do, this is what you can do. That's what they call in the industry a live document. So basically, and then you set whatever the organisation is at the bottom. They go away, they pick a manager, they make sure the manager manages it accordingly. They may come back and say, hey, look, we'd like to open this up, or we'd like to shut this down, depending on which way it is. That would then come back to council for council to adopt an updated SIPO, and then it's reflected back in the manager practice below. So, it is and I guess traditionally what I've seen in other organisations and other councils is that if you do establish an entity at arm's length, that council relies on that entity to bring change back as a recommendation, as opposed to council the other way, sitting there going, oh, we shouldn't be in that and we don't want to do this.
All right, shall we finish the presentation?
Look, this one here is how should we capitalise it? So at the moment we're working on the basis of a $60 to $70 million starting point. Obviously, the more money you can tip into it, the more scale you have. The more scale they have, the more protection you can afford in terms of some of those other things, because a lot of those protection factors are effectively fixed costs. If you put a board in place, it doesn't matter whether the board's looking after 60 million or 150 million, the process is largely the same. It's just that the scale of it in terms of every dollar you've got invested is different. So again, it's one of the questions really is, how can we best capitalise the fund to try and make sure that we get the best benefit? Because if you don't have scale, then you are down in you're either in an expensive option or you're in the lower level options and you build your way up to it, because you can change them over time too. That's probably all now.
So just back on some next steps, as we said at the beginning, this work is connected to other parts of our financial strategy and other kind of work going on. So we'll just kind of go through where we're going on each of those. We're going to bring back some advice to the council in the December 17th paper, which will have the options that we'll go out to consultation with, and that will include options on different sized funds, probably with different allocations of headroom. And again, that'll be linked to those two financial challenges we talked about at the beginning. We'll consult on those early in the new year, and then the decisions that the council will make kind of based on the things we've been talking about today, we'll get to those after consultation once we've got a view about what your preferred option is, what the size of the fund that we're, the scale of the fund that we're going to be establishing, that kind of thing. A lot of these decisions kind of drive off that outcome. And then the work on the captive insurer, the Audit and Risk Committee has sent the team away to do the feasibility study on that, and that's coming back indicatively in February with some advice to the council kind of March, April, and then again, depending on the outcome of that and where the council decides to go, we would connect the work on the fund with the work on the captive and have a think about how those two those tools would work together. That's us.
All right, are there any other questions, councillors? There appear to be none. Thank you, Scott, Catherine and Jessie. That was very interesting. Thank you, team.